All of us have to be prevaricators, hypocrites, and liars every day of our lives. Otherwise, the social structure would fall into pieces the first day. We must act in one another's presence, just as we must wear clothes. It is for the best. Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Storytime for Adults. So, it's been almost a month. We're in the ending days of November. Thanksgiving is upon us. Much has been said about Thanksgiving, from a constantly evolving understanding of its origins, or mythologizing, to widely varying opinions of its rightful meaning or significance today. But one thing about Thanksgiving that certainly is not in question is this. Thanksgiving Day is the one holiday that is completely and thoroughly American. So with that in mind, let's read a story having to do with Thanksgiving. And because this is Thanksgiving time, we'll keep this one short so as not to take us all away from our families and loved ones for too long. And who are we going to be reading today? Well, I'm glad you asked. An American writer, poet, and sometime journalist, known primarily for his prolific short stories, O. Henry has left a literary legacy often overlooked by many. His short stories especially are known for witty observations, an often ironic, sometimes mocking tone, and the frequent use of twist or surprise endings. William Sidney Porter was born on September 11th, 1862 in Greensboro, North Carolina during the height of the Civil War, to Algernon Sidney Porter, a physician, and Mary Jane Virginia Swaim Porter. When Porter was 3, his mother died while giving birth to his younger sibling. After his mother's death, the family moved in with his paternal grandmother. As a child, he was a voracious reader, digesting everything from classic literature to cheap dime store novels and the pulp of the day. After finishing school, Porter went on to work in his uncle's drugstore in Greensboro in 1879, and within 2 years, he was a licensed pharmacist, all in his own right. In 1882, he decided to move to a ranch in Texas with his friend James Hall and worked as a ranch hand before eventually moving on to Austin, Texas. While he was there, he eventually wooed and then eloped with one Athol Estes. Her family had opposed the marriage not because of Porter, but because Athol had tuberculosis and was in relatively poor health. In 1888, a year after marrying, Athol gave birth to a son who only lived a handful of hours, but then in September of 1889, she gave birth to the couple's daughter, Margaret. Porter worked several different jobs while in Austin, one of the most notable being as an appointed draftsman for the Texas Land Commissioner, his friend Richard Hall. This position lasted until Hall was eventually defeated in an election, leading to Porter resigning his post as well. He eventually went to work as teller and bookkeeper at the First National Bank of Austin. Now, this bank was run informally, and apparently that atmosphere either led to carelessness on Porter's part, or what he was eventually actually accused of, which is embezzlement. He lost his job, but was not indicted at that time. Now, Porter had been drawing and sketching since his teenage years, and writing some since before he and Ethel had met, and she actively encouraged him to pursue this. So, after losing his job at the bank, he began working full-time on a humorous weekly publication called The Rolling Stone. It was never really a financial success, but it did manage to garner the attention of the editor of the Houston Post, leading to the family relocating there and Porter getting a job with them. Now, while in Houston, Porter was eventually indicted in federal court for embezzlement. His father-in-law posted bail for him, but then, the day before his trial was set to begin, Porter got scared and fled, first to New Orleans and then eventually to Honduras, since it didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States at that time. When this happened, Athol and Margaret ended up moving in with her parents, as Athol was by this point far too sick to join Porter. He stayed in Honduras for 6 months, writing quite a deal, becoming friends with the famous train robber Al Jennings. Eventually, Porter learned that Athol was dying, prompting him to return to Austin in February of 1897 and surrendering to the court. While awaiting his trial, Athol died in July of that year. He was eventually tried of and convicted for embezzling $854, saying almost nothing in his own defense, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As his conviction was federal, he was sent to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. Since he was a pharmacist, Porter was able to work as the night druggist for the prison hospital while incarcerated, and was given a private room outside the cell block in the hospital wing. While in prison, he wrote and published a large number of short stories under various different pen names. They were all shopped and filtered out to publishers and magazines by a friend of his in New Orleans, so that his publishers never knew that the author was himself incarcerated. It was during this time that he became known under the pen name of Oliver Henry, or O. Henry. He was eventually released from prison after 3 years in 1901 for good behavior, and reunited with his now 11-year-old daughter Margaret in Pittsburgh, where Athel's parents, his parents-in-law, had relocated after his conviction. In 1902, he moved to New York City to be closer to his publishers, and this marked the most prolific phase of his writing. In the next 6 years, he would write 381 short stories, including a stretch where he wrote a new short story every single week for a year for the New York Sunday magazine, or New York World Sunday magazine, apologize. His particular story or style was often panned by literary critics. They were not a fan, but they were beloved by general readers, and he developed a very strong, popular following. He eventually remarried in 1907 to an old childhood sweetheart, Sarah Lindsay Coleman, whom he reunited with while visiting family in Greensboro. Sarah was also a writer who would eventually write a fictionalized version of their relationship titled Wind of Destiny. Now, Porter had been a lifelong heavy drinker, and by this time, it had finally taken its severe toll on his health, and eventually his marriage to Sarah. Sometime in 1909, she left him, and he died on June 5th of 1910. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage brought on by an enlarged heart, cirrhosis of the liver, and complications of untreated diabetes. He was eventually buried in Asheville, North Carolina. His daughter, Margaret, went on to have a very short writing career of her own, but unfortunately, like her mother, she also died at a young age from tuberculosis in 1927 and was buried next to her father. She died with no children of her own. Many of O. Henry's works have been adapted to radio, stage, and television, and the O. Henry Award is a rather prestigious annual prize for short stories that's named after him. His stories were mostly set in the very late 19th and early 20th century when he lived. Most were set in New York or Texas, and those that weren't were typically set in a non-specific rural or small town area. He tended to focus on working class people and their everyday situations. So tonight, we're going to read an appropriately titled story by O. Henry, Two Thanksgiving Gentlemen, first published in 1907 in the collection of short stories, The Trimmed Lamp and Other Stories of the 4 Million. So without further ado, Two Thanksgiving Day Gentlemen. There's one day that is ours. There's one day when all we Americans who are not self-made go back to the old home to eat saleratus biscuits and marvel how much nearer to the porch the old pump looks than it used to. Bless the day. President Roosevelt gave it to us. We hear some talk of the Puritans, but don't just remember who they were. Bet we can lick them anyhow if they try to land again. Plymouth Rocks? Well, that sounds more familiar. Lots of us have had to come down to hens since the Turkey Trust got its work in, but somebody in Washington is leaking out advance information to them about these Thanksgiving proclamations. The big city east of the cranberry bogs has made Thanksgiving Day an institution. The last Thursday in November is the only day in the year on which it recognizes the part of America lying across the ferries. It is the one day that is purely American. Yes, a day of celebration, exclusively American. And now for the story which is to prove to you that we have traditions on this side of the ocean that are becoming older at a much rapider rate than those of England are, thanks to our get-up and enterprise. Stuffy Pete took his seat on the third bench to the right as you enter Union Square from the east, at the walk opposite the fountain. Every Thanksgiving Day for 9 years, he'd taken his seat there promptly at 1 o'clock. For every time he had done so, things had happened to him. Charles Dickensy things that swelled his waistcoat above his heart, and equally on the other side. But today, Stuffy Pete's appearance at the annual trysting place seemed to have been rather the result of habit than of the yearly hunger which, as the philanthropists seem to think, afflicts the poor at such extended intervals. Certainly, Pete was not hungry. He'd just come from a feast that had left him of his powers barely those of respiration and locomotion. His eyes were like two pale gooseberries firmly embedded in a swollen and gravy-smeared mask of putty. His breath came in short wheezes. A senatorial roll of adipose tissue denied a fashionable set to his upturned coat collar. Buttons that had been sewn upon his clothes by kind Salvation fingers a week before flew like popcorn, strewing the earth around him. Ragged he was, with a split shirt front open to the wishbone, but the November breeze carrying fine snowflakes brought him only a grateful coolness. For Stuffy Pete was overcharged with the caloric produced by a super bountiful dinner, beginning with oysters and ending with plum pudding, and including, seemed to him, all the roast turkey and baked potatoes and chicken salad and squash pie and ice cream in the world. Wherefore he sat, gorged and gazed upon the world with after-dinner contempt. The meal had been an unexpected one. He was passing a red brick mansion near the beginning of Fifth Avenue, in which lived two old ladies of ancient family and a reverence for tradition. They even denied the existence of New York, and believed Thanksgiving Day was declared solely for Washington Square. One of their traditional habits was to station a servant at the postern gate with orders to admit the first hungry wayfarer that came along after the hour of noon had struck, and banquet him to a finish. Stuffy Pete happened to pass by on his way to the park, and the seneschals gathered him in and upheld the custom of the castle. Now, after Stuffy Pete had gazed straight before him for 10 minutes, he was conscious of a desire for a more varied field of vision. With a tremendous effort, he moved his head slowly to the left, and then his eyes bulged out fearfully and his breath ceased, and the rough-shod ends of his short legs wriggled and rustled on the gravel. For the old gentleman was coming across Fourth Avenue towards his bench. Every Thanksgiving Day for 9 years, the old gentleman had come there and found Stuffy Pete on his bench. That was a thing that the old gentleman was trying to make a tradition of. For Thanksgiving Day for 9 years, he found Stuffy there and had led him to a restaurant and watched him eat a big dinner. They do those things in England unconsciously, but this is a young country, and 9 years is not so bad. The old gentleman was a staunch American patriot and considered himself a pioneer in American tradition. In order to become picturesque, we must keep on doing one thing for a long time without ever letting it get away from us. Something like collecting the weekly dimes in industrial insurance or cleaning the streets. The old gentleman moved, straight and stately, towards the institution that he was rearing. Truly, the annual feeding of Stuffy Pete was nothing national in its character, such as the Magna Carta or jam for breakfast was in England. But it was a step. It was almost feudal. It showed, at least, that a custom was not impossible. The new America. The old gentleman was thin and tall and 60. He was dressed all in black, and with the old-fashioned kind of glasses that won't stay on your nose. His of the park. In the winter, he raised fuchsias in a little conservatory the size of a steamer trunk. In the spring, he walked in the Easter parade. In the summer, he lived in a farmhouse in the New Jersey hills and sat in a wicker armchair, speaking of a butterfly, the Ornithopteria amphrisius, that he hoped to find one day. In the autumn, he fed Stuffy a dinner. These were the old gentleman's occupations. Stuffy Pete looked up at him for a half-minute, stewing and helpless in his own self-pity. The old gentleman's eyes were bright with the giving pleasure. His face was getting more lined each year, but his little black necktie was in as jaunty a bow as ever, and the linen was beautiful and white, and his gray mustache was curled carefully at the ends. And then Stuffy made a noise that sounded like peas bubbling in a pot. The speech was intended, and as the old gentleman had heard the sounds 9 times before, he rightly construed them into Stuffy's old formula of acceptance. "Thank you, sir. I'll go with you, and much obliged. Very hungry, sir." The coma of repletion had not prevented from entering Stuffy's mind the conviction that he was the basis of an institution. His Thanksgiving appetite was not his own. It belonged by all the sacred rights of established custom, if not by the actual statute of limitations, to this kind old gentleman who had bad preempted it. True, America's free, but in order to establish traditions, someone must be a repeating decimal. The heroes are not all heroes of steel and gold. See one here that yielded only weapons of iron, badly silvered and tin. The old gentleman led his annual protege southward to the restaurant, and to the table where the feast had always occurred. They were recognized. "Here comes the old guys," said a waiter. That blows that same bum to a meal every Thanksgiving. The old gentleman sat across the table, glowing like a smoked pearl at his cornerstone, a future ancient tradition. The waiters heaped the table with holiday food, and Stuffy, with a sigh that was mistaken for hunger's expression, raised knife and fork and carved for himself a crown of imperishable bay. No more valiant hero ever fought his way through the ranks of an enemy. Turkey, chops, soups, vegetables, pies disappeared before him as fast as they could be served. Gorged nearly to the uttermost, when he entered the restaurant, the smell of food had almost caused him to lose his honor as a gentleman, but he rallied like a true knight. He saw the look of beneficent happiness in the old gentleman's face, a happier look than even the fuchsias and the ornithopteria amphiosus had ever brought to it, and he had not the heart to see it wane. In an hour, Stuffy leaned back with a battle won. "Thank you kindly, sir." He puffed like a leaky steam pipe. "Thank you kindly for a hearty meal." Then he arose heavily, with glazed eyes, and started towards the kitchen. A waiter turned him about like a top and pointed him towards the door. The old gentleman carefully counted out $1.30 in silver change, leaving 3 nickels for the waiter. They parted as they did each year at the door, the old gentleman going south, Stuffy north. Around the first corner Stuffy turned and stood for 1 minute. Then he seemed to puff out his rags as an owl puffs out its feathers, and fell to the sidewalk like a sun-stricken horse. When the ambulance came, the young surgeon and the driver cursed softly at his weight. There was no smell of whiskey to justify a transfer to the patrol wagon, so Stuffy and his 2 dinners went to the hospital. There they stretched him out on a bed and began to test him for strange diseases, with the hope of getting a chance at some problem with the bare steel. And lo, an hour later another ambulance brought the old gentleman, and they laid him on another bed and spoke of appendicitis, for he looked good for the bill. But pretty soon one of the young doctors met one of the young nurses, whose eyes he liked, and stopped to chat with her about the cases. "That nice old gentleman over there now," he said. "You wouldn't think that was a case of almost starvation. Proud old family, I guess. He told me he hadn't eaten a thing for 3 days. And that's our tale. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we will see you next time.